We're back to talk about another of the Cold War crises that you guys could write about on your paper two exam, that being in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But let's start with a little background to this crisis. First, the geography. Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida, and the United States has long viewed that Cuba is within its sphere of influence, and that any government in Cuba should reflect American interests. We've long had economic ties with Cuba. American companies built and controlled financial, rail, electric, and sugar industries in Cuba. After Cuban independence following the Spanish-American War, the United States included the Platt Amendment with the Cuban Constitution, which established a naval base and a permanent lease on Guantanamo Bay, which is on the far eastern side of the Cuban island. There's east over there. And the United States also said that they could intervene in Cuban affairs for the preservation of Cuban independence and the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. And of course, as we get to the Cold War era, the United States is going to start exercising that idea. Now, in the 1950s, there will be a revolution in Cuba as the pro-American Cuban government of Fulgencio Batista is overthrown by Fidel Castro. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we specifically deal with Cuba during the Cold War. But for now, let's just say that the United States had supported Batista in previous years because he was not a communist, but that had waned as he refused to offer democratic reforms and he lost the support of most Cubans. The United States will almost immediately recognize the new government of Fidel Castro. Castro denied that he was a communist and he reached out to the United States for assistance, which in many cases we were willing to give, but it often came with strings attached. And when Fidel Castro moved, as he had promised, to nationalize Cuban industry and begin land reform programs, taking land away from wealthy Cubans and distributing it to others, many pro-US Cubans fled to the United States. The United States refused to aid Castro, and he turned to the Soviet Union for financial assistance. The American response to this was swift. The United States was afraid of having a Soviet client state just 90 miles away from the United States, and we launched an embargo on all exports to Cuba besides food and medicine. This move is going to drive Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union, which is a theme that's going to be repeated. Actions by the United States to harm the Cuban government of Castro that we didn't like is going to push Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union again and again. The United States will plan through its CIA to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles, which becomes known as the Cuban Bay of Pigs invasion. This is a part of President Eisenhower's new look strategy of using the CIA for covert operations in order to get pro-American government and remove communist governments, particularly in Latin America. This Bay of Pigs invasion will be created by Eisenhower's CIA, but ultimately handed over to the Kennedy administration. Cuban expatriates are going to be trained for an amphibious invasion at the Bay of Pigs that we believed would lead to a popular uprising against the Castro regime. When Kennedy inherited the plan upon his inauguration, he ultimately approved its launch by March of 1961. The invasion was an absolute failure. Most of the Cuban exiles were captured. The CIA drastically underestimated the support that Castro had had from the Cuban people. We underestimated the Cuban air defenses and air forces, and we did not supply direct air support to this invasion, which makes an amphibious invasion very difficult. The effects of this: humiliation for the Kennedy administration, weaker positions in Latin America for the United States. This was a Soviet propaganda victory, and it would strengthen ties between the Soviet Union and Cuba. After the attack, for example, Castro officially declares himself a Marxist and will sign a defensive alliance with the Soviet Union. And it is this defensive alliance that brings the Soviet missiles into Cuba. Begins in 1962 when the Soviet Union began to station intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba. This was to balance the fact that the United States had missiles already next door to the Soviet Union in Turkey, and to protect Cuba from future invasions. In October of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba took these pictures, which would show the Kennedy administration that these missiles were in fact in Cuba. This would increase the Soviet Union's first strike capability against the United States. And if this was released to the public, could destroy the Democrats' chances in the 1962 midterm elections. So what we have now is the official Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days in October of 1962, where the world was on the doorstep of nuclear war. Now, Kennedy, to his part, rejected calls for an immediate airstrike of Cuba and invasions of Cuba that was called for by leaders of the United States military, including the Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay. Kennedy did order a naval blockade of Cuba to stop all incoming shipments, as we believed that there were incoming warheads to fuel those missiles. This was called a quarantine, though, as a blockade is seen as an act of war, and the United States did not want to turn this into a military conflict. The Soviet Union initially ignored the quarantine and continued sending ships, but ultimately pulled them back. The crisis is resolved with a telegram received by the Kennedy administration from Khrushchev, who agrees to remove the missiles out of Cuba for a pledge to not invade Cuba. Shortly after, a second telegram arrived, also calling for the removal of American missiles from Turkey and taking a much harsher tone. Kennedy responded to that first telegram, agreed to leave Castro alone, to not invade Cuba, and the Soviet missiles would be removed, while secretly agreeing to remove missiles from Turkey in the new year after those elections had passed. So the conflict was avoided, the crisis is averted. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a creation of a hotline, a telephone connection between Washington, D.C. and Moscow will be established. Also, the Soviets and the Americans will sign the first of what will be many nuclear reductions treaties, this being the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, later in the 1960s, a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, encouraging the end of development of new nuclear weapons. Kennedy's stature would increase following the Bay of Pigs disaster. Kennedy is seen as a hero that protected the United States from a war with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev also claimed victory as Cuba would remain a socialist nation 90 miles from Florida, though he would lose support within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, who saw him as weak in this conflict with the United States. Castro, for his part, was furious with Khrushchev for backing down. And it was said later that Castro even encouraged Khrushchev to use the nuclear weapons should the United States get moved to invade the Soviet, or move to invade Cuba. The missiles would later be removed from Turkey, but the United States deemed those as outdated anyway. And by this point in the Cold War, we've got sub-launched ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the missiles in Turkey weren't even really needed anymore. And that is the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now you've got Berlin in 1961 and Cuba in 61 and 62 to deal with for Cold War conflicts or Cold War crises. We'll talk to you later. Take care.